Okay, welcome to tonight's program, Accidental Travel Writer, Postcards from Madagascar, presented by David Mould with Storrs Library. My name is Lindsay. I'm a library assistant here with Storrs Library. Tonight, David will share about his travels to Madagascar and offer us glimpses of the history, culture, traditions, and politics of a beguiling but desperately poor country. A little bit about David, PhD Professor Emeritus of Media Arts and Studies at Ohio University, has traveled widely in Asia and Southern Africa. Born in the UK, he worked as a newspaper and TV journalist before moving to the United States. His travel essays and articles have been published in Newsweek, Christian Science Monitor, Times Higher Education, and History News Network. His books include Monsoon, Postcards, Indian Ocean Journeys, and Postcards from Stanland, Journeys in Central Asia. David, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Lindsay. I much appreciate it. And thank you to Storrs Library. I think this is the 6th one I've done, and I've got a couple more to go there. So it's my regular first Tuesday of the month date. So let me just explain my background here, that cactus there. I kind of chose that because Madagascar's been in the news recently for kind of all of the wrong reasons. This is cactus in southern Madagascar. And believe me, some people, for some people, this is all they have to eat right now. There's a major drought, a major humanitarian catastrophe in southern Madagascar, and the World Food Programme is in there, but this is always an area of the country that has drought, but this year it's been worse than ever. At the same time, the east coast of Madagascar has got thumped by a major cyclone in the last week or so, which also hit the east coast of Africa. And so while people in the south are living on cactus and are hoping for a little bit of rain, on the east coast there's major flooding, roads and bridges have been washed out. Madagascar seems to get the worst of the weather. So I'm just going to share my screen here and okay. So thank you everybody for joining me. We're going to get to this little car later. This is a Renault 4L. I will explain its significance later. So let me see. Oops. It's not working here. Let me just get back to my original PowerPoint here and try that from the beginning. There we go. Okay, so I've done a lot of travel over the last 25 years. I think this is a complete list of countries. And as I travel, mostly on somebody else's dime, I work for international agencies, most recently UNICEF. As I do my teaching or my training or my consulting, I wander around and I take notes in a kind of random sort of way. But then, as some of you know, I send email essays back to family, friends, and a sort of a growing list of people who get little travel tidbits from me. And then, after a few years, was a book. So as Lindsay said, my first book, based on my experiences in Central Asia, started in the mid-1990s, 4 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. Postcards from Stanland, and that's actually a kind of a joke, because I would come back and people would say, "Where have you been?" I said, "I've been to Kyrgyzstan." And they go, "Oh, all those countries that end in Stan, I get them mixed up. You've been to Stanland." Of course, that's total nonsense, because the word Stan in Persian means land, so literally I've been to land. Tonight's presentation draws from my second book, Monsoon Postcards, Indian Ocean Journeys, which focuses not only on Madagascar, but on India, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. And the next two presentations I'll be doing for Storrs are respectively on Bangladesh and Indonesia. And Postcards from the Borderlands, my most recent book, came out at the end of 2020, looks at the experience of crossing borders, indeed on many continents. And I think some of you have seen this before. These are my travel mantras. You've got to kind of go with the flow, as Paul Theroux and others have done. And I particularly like the quote from Thomas Swick, former Florida. You know, he's a freelance writer these days, freelance travel writer. Travel's only interesting when things go wrong, which means you don't go looking for trouble, but you know, it's only when things kind of don't go to plan that you actually have stories to tell about travel. So, Madagascar, fourth largest island in the world, a little larger than Texas. But when you hear the word Madagascar, kind of what images come to your mind? I'm going to suggest a few. Oh, I think somebody broke into my PowerPoint and put in this slide. No, seriously. Actually, I was playing pickleball today with somebody who said, "What are you presenting on tonight?" I said, "Madagascar," and she said, "I've seen the movie," which sort of reinforced my notion of people's perception of what Madagascar means. And this was a 2005 computer animated comedy hit from DreamWorks, 4 animals from New York Central Park Zoo. They're suddenly repatriated to Africa, shipwrecked off the coast of Madagascar. And there were 2 sequels, including the rather implausibly named The Penguins of Madagascar. And The Penguins of Madagascar actually premiered in China, which may account for the fact that when you type Madagascar into the search box on Baidu, which is China's leading search engine, when you type Madagascar in there, the leading autocomplete result is penguins. So, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, Madagascar has certain associations which really have very little to do with the country at all. So this is kind of the first image. Then there's what I'll call wild Madagascar, the flora and the fauna. It's all baobab trees, the one on the top right, and cuddly little lemurs. Because it was separated from other land masses for 80 million years, more or less, who's counting, Madagascar developed a unique ecosystem. So more than 12,000 plant species, almost 10,000 of them found nowhere else in the world. 350 reptile species, 43 primates, including that guy on the top left, and in the middle at the bottom, the cuddly lemur. There's actually many types of lemurs. And so the biodiversity attracts thousands of tourists when they could travel, mostly from North America and Europe, who take guided tours through the jungle and some of the deserts. So that's image number 2. This is image number 3, beaches and haute cuisine. So Madagascar is a favorite, safely exotic destination for French vacationers who come for the beaches, they come for the nightlife, and the excellent and very reasonably priced haute cuisine. In the French tourist brochures, Madagascar sits alphabetically between its 2 main tropical rivals, the French-speaking Caribbean islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique. But you can fly directly from Paris to the place at the top left. It's called Nosy Bay, which means big island in Malagasy. You avoid all the traffic jams and the noise and the discomforts of the capital. So you can have coffee and croissant in the morning at Charles de Gaulle Airport, and then you can have confit de canard washed down with a nice Côte du Rhône in the evening at your resort hotel. Everybody speaks French, and if it wasn't for the glorious weather and the palm trees, you wouldn't know you'd left home. So that's kind of image number 3. Here's image number 4. I don't know how well you can see it in the picture on the left, but this is actually one of my favorite restaurants in the capital, Antananarivo. So the image here is sort of the typical stereotype of Africa. Madagascar is one of those crazy, mixed-up African countries, never quite got its act together, notorious for political instability. So if you look at the, it's spelled coup d'etat. Madagascar has had more coups, more political coups than any other country in Africa since independence. The cartoon from the Philadelphia Inquirer on the right, mad as a hatter. What a crazy country here. So I made 6 visits to Madagascar in about an 18-month period. From the end of 2014 onwards. I was working with an international team and faculty from the National University there on a research project for UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund. Now, the project didn't go very well in the end, primarily because UNICEF sort of screwed it up, but it gave me a rare opportunity to travel around a fascinating country and then write about it. And I would love to go back. In fact, I'm writing about Madagascar right now. It's a historical writing project, and it's just really stirring up in me the desire to go back to this country. So, a little history, but not too much, okay? Madagascar was not always an island. It was once part of this supercontinent called Gondwana, and I'm going to really simplify and compress millions of years of history here. As Gondwana started breaking apart 180 million years ago, more or less, Madagascar detached itself from Africa and floated off into its present position in the Indian Ocean. Well, that's probably putting it a little too simply in terms of what happened geologically there. But, it raises an interesting question. Is it an island? It's got its long geologic history, wide range of vegetation and climatic zones, and its biodiversity. So some people have actually called it the 8th continent because it is so distinctive, from Africa and from Asia. Human settlement came quite late, as far as we know, as far as the archaeologists have discovered. Probably not before the 5th century. By that time, trade routes had been established around the Indian Ocean, linking Southeast Asia, India, the Arabian Peninsula, and East Africa. So you kind of would have expected the first settlers to come across from Africa, making the relatively short hop, it's not that short, but comparatively short hop, across the Mozambique Channel, from Mozambique to Africa. Oh, I guess, you're letting them in, Lindsay, I guess. Yeah, okay. Astonishingly, though, they came from the other side of the Indian Ocean, from the Malay archipelago, or what today is Indonesia. And I mean, this has been well traced. The Malagasy language borrows words from Javanese, Malay, and the languages of Borneo and Sulawesi. Some of the crops, rice in particular, are found throughout Southeast Asia. And so how they got there, I mean, they wouldn't have got straight across. It was probably over a period of maybe centuries that, groups moved around the Indian Ocean, around the north part of the Indian Ocean, ending up in Madagascar. And then there were later migrants coming from Africa, Bantu peoples, and most of them were herders. They brought their animals with them. So you have this really interesting ethnic mix, people who were originally from Asia and people from Africa. And this actually has a lot to do with some of the continuing tensions within the country, politically and economically. So a second wave of settlers came from the Malay archipelago, Indonesia today, between the 8th and the 12th century, and they were called the Mariner. And they brought with them their traditional clan organization and their agricultural practices, particularly rice cultivation. They settled mostly in the highland regions, and look at the picture on the right. These are the rice paddies there. And you know, with their skin color and straight dark hair, they look Asian. I mean, you know, these folks, these young people on the left, I could see them in Indonesia. They, you know, or Malaysia. I mean, they're very, very ethnically, physically similar there. However, as I said, many communities, especially in coastal regions, are ethnically mixed, and those who came from the Malay archipelago and those who came from the coast of Africa, there were Arab seafarers, later Chinese and Indian traders, and European settlers. From the 17th century, Madagascar became important in the Indian Ocean trade in silk, spices, and slaves. And the European colonial powers, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and the British, all tried to establish trading posts, but most of the settlements were short-lived. The tribes, especially in the south, were hostile, and disease and climate took their toll. The only group that really made it in Madagascar were the pirates, who used the harbours of the east coast to prey on merchant ships sailing between Africa or south of Africa and India, and also pilgrims on ships going from India to the Hajj to Mecca in Arabia. And many of them settled there, many of them took Malagasy wives. But by the mid-18th century, the British Navy had sent most of them packing off to the Caribbean, and the island was kind of divided between warring clans, little fiefdoms, who were always fighting each other over land and over cattle, and taking slaves and taking captives that they used or sold as slave labor. So here's when things changed. There'll be a test later and you'll be asked to remember this name. This is the guy, and this is sort of a later representation of him, the chieftain who in the late 18th century formed a powerful kingdom in the highlands. Presumably some of his rival Mariner chiefs surrendered rather than trying to pronounce his name. I throw this in because it's quite a fun, and he's actually usually known as Antananarivo in Imarina, like the first third or quarter of the name, which means the Lord at the heart of Imarina, the Lord at the heart of the kingdom. But kind of like European monarchs were, you know, king of this and duke of that and earl of that and, you know, viscount of that. I mean, in the Malagasy language, they just put it all together. So this kind of lists all the places that he was lord of. The first part, Andriana, in Malagasy means lord or king. In 1807, the British abandoned or abolished the slave trade in their colonies. This was during the Napoleonic Wars, and the British were competing with the French for dominance in the Indian Ocean. And the British struck a deal with this guy's son, a guy called Radama, basically guns for slaves, in return for halting the slave trade, the export of slaves from Madagascar to the islands of Mauritius and Réunion, two island colonies, a British one and a French one, to the east of Madagascar. The British, provided guns. The British provided ammunition, training for the army, enabling Radama to, expand his kingdom, as you'll see on the right. So by 1840, the mariner control most of the island there. And there was a lot of hypocrisy around this, because while the British stopped the export of slaves, they had nothing to do with stopping the internal slave trade within Madagascar. So until the end of the 19th century, captives were taken, slaves were bought and sold throughout the island. That ended when the French came. Madagascar was colonized late compared with other parts of Africa. And in 1895, the French landed. It was a very, very quick military campaign. They overthrew the mariner monarchy, and French settlers arrived, starting to dominate the economy. And Madagascar remained a French colony until 1960, although there was a rebellion in 1947, 48, I'd have to check that, which the French brutally crushed. So that's my little bit of history. So let me introduce you to this guy. His name is Richard Samuel, and a colleague, a friend, and he teaches sociology at the National University, the University of Antananarivo. You can see it on the map there, the capital of Madagascar. And we're just going to go on a little bit of a trip with him now. He invited me to join him and his wife Tina to their hometown, this place Anivonimamo, which is just to the west of Antananarivo. It's about 50 or 60 miles. They were building their retirement home, and it was a weekend, he wanted to show me where he'd grown up. And I choose Richard because he's, kind of emblematic of how complicated it sometimes gets to think about culture in a country like Madagascar. So he claims to be descended from a former king. Now, by king, he probably means a clan chieftain, because the word king is kind of used somewhat loosely. But certainly his ancestors were local nobility, whose power derived from the size of their cattle herds and the land that they controlled. And I mean, it's interesting that he sort of still claims some moral authority due to this noble lineage, and in his case, healing powers. And this is a direct quote. I mean, he said it in French, but I wrote it down. He has, or claims to have, this ability inherited to cure burns. And I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. This is a guy with an advanced university degree. He's got degrees in economics and development studies. He teaches sociology. He's had senior positions in government ministries. He's an academic, yet he's a descendant of nobility and a traditional healer. I mean, these two worlds sort of come together really, really well. I found it to be absolutely fascinating. So we drive out of the capital into the highlands here, the picture on the left there. We're on Route Nationale 1, which sounds rather grand, but it's actually a kind of a two-lane highway, not well maintained in places. And we go up and down the low hills. There are brick kilns where bricks are manufactured to make houses. Most houses are built with rough mud bricks, and we stop at the roadside to eat fresh corn grilled in these big pots called kokots. And I asked Richard, I said, well, so what about farming in Madagascar? And he said it's very hard to make a living from farming these days. A lot of people are subsistence farmers, but by tradition, land is divided among the sons. So over generations, farm plots have become smaller. The national average for a family farm, he said, and remember, he's an economist, so he knows this stuff, is about half a hectare hectare, which is about half the size of a football field. And so many people simply have to leave the land. They come to the cities, particularly to the capital, Antananarivo, which everybody abbreviates as Tana. Lots of syllables in the Malagasy language. And they get by on what's called petit commerce. They sell farm produce, they sell second-hand clothes or cheap consumer items. So as in other developing countries, a lot of rural depopulation. So this is Anivonimamo, his hometown, and I have to explain what the meaning there. I mean, translated, it means the town of 1,000 drunks. And so remember that guy with the long name, the king, we showed you before, Antananarivo. That's the first part of his name. So while he was conquering the Central Highlands, he sent 1,000 soldiers to capture this market town. And there wasn't much resistance. People went, okay, we'll be captured, that's okay. So there wasn't much for the soldiers to do but to get drunk on home-brewed sugarcane rum and give the town its name. So in Malagasy, Arivo means 1,000 and Nimamo, drunks, the town of 1,000 drunks. So we stopped for lunch on the main street and visited Richard's family home, visited the Catholic high school. Most Malagasy are Christians, or at least claim to be Christians. He was educated by Canadian friars, and as we walked around the street, people came up to him and asked him for his advice. Remember, he's sort of his nobility here. They might have also been asking him for money, I'm not quite sure. But, his family's well known in the area. Then we drove out of town to the place where he and his wife Tina, who's on the right there in the garden, the picture, are building their retirement home. And the guy on the left is his brother, Lala, wearing a sort of Brazil soccer T-shirt there. The parents had 7 children. 3 of the brothers had died, leaving Richard, Lala, and 2 sisters. But Richard was the only one to go to high school and university. And we walked outside to the garden where they'd planted manioc, coffee, and lychees, as well as herbs. And from the garden, it was only a few steps to the family cemetery. Half a dozen above-ground stone and concrete tombs. And there's a couple of these cattle, they're called zebu, they're horned cattle, are walking, just grazing around there. And I pointed to one grave that had been, this would have been in 2016. I pointed to one grave in the earth which was decorated with flowers. And Richard said, yes, last year we lost an elder brother. And soon after we buried him, a cousin died. We will move them into the tomb at the proper time. You can't just open up a tomb when someone dies. So this gets us to a rather important ceremony or ritual in Malagasy culture, the so-called Famadihana, the turning of the bones. And Richard quoted this, I think rather lovely proverb: when you're alive, you live together under the same roof. When you die, you live together in the same tomb. So for the Merina, the proper time to bury is the so-called Famadihana, literally the turning of the bones. This is a 3-day celebration where the tombs are opened and the bones of the ancestors are taken out and they are rewrapped in silk shawls, where the word is lumber. This is a way in which you communicate with your ancestors. This is a way in which you seek blessing from your ancestors. And, in some ways it's a big party. There's a band there, there's quite a lot of drinking going on, but literally the bodies of the ancestors, or the bones of the ancestors, are paraded around and then rewrapped in these silk shawls and sprinkled with rum and honey, then rewrapped and then taken back into the tomb, together with, the bones of whoever died. This is done. I was told that it's done about once every 7 years. So basically, those who've died in between have to be in, shall we say, temporary accommodation until they can be moved into the tomb. And in the tomb itself, the family tomb, I think I haven't been into one. They wouldn't really let me in one, but I think everything's labeled, so everybody knows. This is so and so, this is so and so, this is so and so, because when they're brought out of the tomb for the Famadihana, they're brought out in a strict order at all. So it's a big occasion, also an expensive one. Everybody's in the family is supposed to chip in to the host, and usually held in winter after the harvest when families have some money. Winter's also the dry season, so there's less risk of infection at that time. Okay, we're going to now go to the capital, Antananarivo, which, as I said, is normally abbreviated as Tana. And, the first time I went there, it was just an extraordinary sight. And I wrote down Paris with rice paddies, because that was kind of the feeling I got about the place. 4,000 feet above sea level, narrow, winding cobblestone streets, and a lot of hills and ridges with churches, kind of the Montmartre of Tana, built on the top of the hills. And until the mid-19th century, all of the buildings were made out of sort of natural materials, out of wood, grasses and reeds, because stone was reserved for the tombs of the ancestors. But then after a series of fires in the capital, the queen at the time, Ranavalona, lifted the edict, and so people were actually able to use stone and brick there. And at the bottom you'll see on the right, or two on the right are the typical Malagasy house called the Tranogati, and which is a sort of a two-story brick building with columns at the front and a fairly steep roof and a veranda. So the city expanded, especially after the French arrived, and so there's a whole new part of the city which looks much more French. And the French influence, I think, is still very apparent in the architecture here. French influence in the language, in the architecture, in the cafe and restaurant menus. The place on the right is the railroad station. The railroad doesn't run there anymore, at least not passengers, but the station is still there. And as in a French provincial town, the picture at the bottom is the Café de la Gare. That's the restaurant or cafe at the railroad station. And with its dark wood, wood paneling and white-shirted raiders, you really could be in a French provincial town. So the French brought law and order, roads and railroads, schools, a health system, nice restaurants, good pastries, but they also forced people to leave their homes and work on plantations. France is still the leading foreign investor, though China's catching up. And France is still seen as a place to get higher education, maybe to migrate for work. And then there are the cars, okay? I don't know if these are familiar to any of you here if you've traveled in France, but this is the Renault 4L, the Renault 4L, which was introduced in France in the early 1960s, aimed at the lower end of the market. It was kind of one of the French equivalents to the Volkswagen Beetle. And together with which you'll see it in a moment, the Citroën 2 Chevaux. Two lower end markets, sort of, marketed as a people's car. Seriously underpowered, but once it sort of made up to its cruising speed of about 50 miles an hour. It chugged along very nicely and didn't use a lot of gas. This is the other one, the Citroen 2CV, or Deux Chevaux as it's called, and it comes in, saloon versions and van versions. Now, these cars, have pretty much disappeared from the roads of France. I mean, you'll occasionally see one that's been lovingly restored. When I visit France, my sister lives there, you'll see one, some of these rusting away in barns in the country. But in Madagascar and in Tana, these are the most common cars on the street. It's a little bit like the American cars in Havana, okay? They've kind of kept them going here, kept them running. Now, sometimes the driver the white ones here or the cream ones here are the most common taxis in the city. I mean, it's a very bumpy ride because the suspension's gone, and sometimes the driver has to kind of hot wire the ignition to start it. But they've kept them going here. Now, you kind of wonder how they do that. So, I kind of start asking these questions here. And there's a French word called bricolage, which literally means, it's from the verb bricoler, which means to tinker, or loosely translated as do it yourself. If you go to France and you go to the equivalent of a Lowe's or a Home Depot, it's called the Brico, the sort of the do it yourself store. So what they've worked out here is that they can import, the parts are have not been manufactured for years. But what they've worked out here is that they can import parts from India and Pakistan for especially the Indian cars made there, the Tatas and the Mahindras, and they'll either fit, or if they don't quite fit, what you do is you take the part to one of the many metal fabrication shops that are all over the city, and they'll make it work. And if they can't make it work, they'll make a part for you. So there's a lot of recycling that goes on here. And, Madagascar is a poor country. People kind of just make it work. Okay, we're going to go and just make a little note here. This is back to my favorite restaurant, Coup d'etat. And, one of the reasons Madagascar is, not the only reason, one of the reasons it remains a relatively poor country is it's been politically very unstable. And a weak central government, a lot of corruption, this is one of the tragedies in the current situation. The central government really doesn't have the money or indeed the authority to do much about the environmental crises in both the south and the east. So, we'll go to the area where the European and North American tourist goes. This is Undersea Bay National Park, where people come to see the wildlife, and they stay at these rather nice lodges here. I went to one of them. We had a seminar there, or we had a meeting there, a work meeting, but it was nice. And on the break, you go off to see the lemurs. So, here I am. And I think you can probably see in that picture on the left, there's a little lemur hiding in a tree there. But you don't have to go very far off into the jungle to find them. At this place called the Wakona Lodge, they live on a small island on the river. And they don't go hide from you. When they see you coming, they bound out because they hope you brought them bananas to eat and climb on your shoulders. So it's very accessible wildlife. I'm kind of torn on this one. It's important to protect the wildlife of Madagascar. It's great biodiversity. But as my friend, the anthropologist Luke Freeman, said to me, and we were on the same page, what about the people? A lot of effort is going into preserving biodiversity while people are starving. And so it is, one of these real challenges you face in a lot of developing countries. Okay, we're going to finish with a trip to southern Madagascar, to the place on the map called Tulliana, formerly Tulliana, on the southwest coast, from the capital Antananarivo. And I'll just explain how I got to make this overland trip. It was fortuitous, I will say. So I was going to be doing a workshop in Tulliana for university faculty. But when I flew in from Paris to Antananarivo and was met by the UNICEF car, they informed me that Air Madagascar, the only domestic airline, was on strike, and so we would have to drive. So how long will the trip take, I asked. I suppose, it was a Saturday afternoon. It was about 500 miles. I suppose it would take a bit over a day. The driver said, well, that sort of depends here. So we set off. So it's officially 577 miles between Antananarivo and Tulliana. And all the guidebooks say that Route Nationale 7 is the best road in the country. I guess it's all relative. I'd classify it as a two-lane highway with many one-lane bridges as a superior county road in Ohio, West Virginia, or maybe a lesser state route in need of some maintenance. But for better or worse, this is the main road to the south. And you look at that place, Fort Dauphin, which is way at the south there, and you can sort of see there's a dotted line there on Route Nationale 3. That's another couple of days' travel there on dirt roads, which they also call it Route Nationale, even though it's a dirt road. So here we are, winding around here. Driving on the road, it seemed like half the country was out there. They were traveling by shared taxi. It's called Taxi Bruce or bush taxi. They were, piled high with luggage and bicycles. There were cattle on the road, people walking a lot. It's sort of typical African scene here. Of course, most people were not on the roads, but outside the towns I saw very few east-west roads with a tarmac surface, and who knows how far that went. So poor infrastructure, primarily the roads, but also the lack of electricity supply in rural areas, is a major barrier to economic development. And in the rainy season, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation, which is January through March, landslips block the road, sections wash away, develop huge potholes. South of a place called Fianarantsoa, the road turns southwest and you get into the grasslands. It kind of looks a bit like Montana there, and then into this almost sort of southwestern landscape here. There's many, many ecosystems within Madagascar, which is the driest part of the country, and this is the area where the current drought is going on. But in parts it could be Montana or Wyoming or New Mexico or Arizona. And then we end up in Tulliana, and this is a city of coutiers, or coastal people, most of whom, unlike the men of the highlands, were immigrants, or ancestors were immigrants from Africa. And very few cars on the road there. A lot of people go around these on bicycles or on these bicycle rickshaws there. And it kind of had this sort of feel of this sort of forgotten outpost of the French Empire here. And a lot of restaurants and bars where French had settled and trade. So it kind of had this sort of feeling of the outpost of empire. Anyway, I'm returning here, and by the end of the week, the president of Madagascar, or whoever was president that week, because the presidency changes pretty frequently, had replaced the director of the airline, and he'd promised to address the strikers' grievances. So Air Madagascar was flying again. And I love this quote from somebody who said, Air maybe, they've flown a lot, so maybe it'll fly, maybe it won't, all sorts of things that will stop Air Madagascar from flying. So it was on a kind of an aging Boeing 737, but the flight was smooth. It took just an hour and a quarter by air, a trip that had taken more than 2 days by route. But I was really glad, in fact, that Air Madagascar or Air Maybe had been on strike when I arrived. If they hadn't been, I would have just flown, and I would not have had that experience on the road from Tana all the way down to Tulliana. So that's the end of the presentation here, and I would be really, really happy to take questions or comments. As I say, Madagascar's is a place it's one of those fascinating but also infuriating countries, if I could sort of put both of those adjectives into the same sentence. But if I have an opportunity, I'd be on a plane. I'll be on a plane there tomorrow. So thank you so much. As I say, this comes from my second book, Monsoon Postcards, Indian Ocean Journeys. And if you want to get in touch with me, I'm just going to put my email into the chat box here. Okay.
David, we have a question in the chat. Once freed, did some of the freed slaves stay in Madagascar? If so, how do their descendants fare today in the country?
Really interesting question. Hang on, let me just get this right here. So that's my email. This is a very interesting question. Madagascar still has pretty strong historical class distinctions, and a lot of anthropologists have done a lot of work in Madagascar, and there are certain communities where people are the descendants of freed slaves, some of these communities do not have much contact with other communities which are not the descendants of freed slaves. So, there's all of these kind of intricate class and caste distinctions. And of course, there are many ethnic groups within Madagascar, and within each group, the distinctions were somewhat different. But when you dig down a little bit, or at least when the anthropologists dig down, they will find communities, who are the descendants of slaves who continue to be marginalized. They probably don't own their land. I'm sure some of them have done okay, some of them have kind of, as in other countries, have, economically done better. But the Malagasy are very tied to their rural roots, even if they've been in the city a long time. One of the questions is, which village are you from which region? And people can then usually work out kind of where they are in this rather complex social strata. And I'm not claiming to understand this in any depth as well, but this is actually one of the reasons why anthropologists find it a fascinating place to study, because there are so many, not only the distinction between the mariner and the highland people and the people on the coast, but kind of within all of these groups, different classes, different strata. Okay, how well nourished is the general population? Is there any real hunger? Yes, there is. There is starvation in the south, and it hasn't been on the news recently, but about 3 or 4 weeks ago, at least on the media I read, which is BBC and The Guardian, there's widespread famine in southern Madagascar, where the crops have failed, and there's very little water. And again, look at the my virtual image here. This is how some of the land looks. And so even if you've got cattle, there's not much of that for them to graze on. And the situation is exacerbated by the difficulties in distribution, because the road system is very bad, and so for more remote communities, it's really, really difficult to get access to food for them actually to come to towns or villages to get it, or for international organizations to distribute it. So the situation is worse in the south. If you're up in the north in the tourist area or in the capital, you wouldn't think there's any hunger going on. So it's quite specific to the south of the country, where there are these kind of almost desert landscapes which are getting drier and drier. What does China see in Madagascar? Okay. Yeah. When you come out of the airport in Antananarivo, the first building you see is a Chinese casino. Well, China sees mineral. I didn't have time to go into this. China sees mineral deposits. Madagascar's got a lot of mineral deposits, including rare metals that are, if they could be accessed, some of them are actually going to be rather valuable. There's bauxite as well, make aluminum. So, and what I think is going to happen here is that international mining companies, Rio Tinto's already in there, a few other mining companies, they and the Chinese are going to go in, and they're going to start pulling out their minerals. The thing that's really holding them back here is the transportation system, because it's just costly to basically, if you have a mine, you're going to have to build at least you're going to have to build a road to the mine, and so the infrastructure's not there. But I think China sees it mostly in terms. It's not much. Chinese goods are sold, but people don't have a lot of money, or at least most people don't have a lot of money. So it's not a big market for Chinese goods. I think China sees it primarily as a source of raw materials. How is the education system? It's pretty underfunded, pretty bad. I wouldn't say pretty bad. There are schools everywhere. When we were doing research for UNICEF, one of the things we were looking at was education and how long children went to school. And the numbers there are they're not. They're better than some other African countries there. One of the problems there is, children may go to school, but what do they learn? Because many of the teachers are unqualified. Many of the teachers have barely finished secondary education themselves. Teachers are poorly paid. Some of them don't show up for work. The schools don't have textbooks. The schools don't have electricity. In harvest season, the children have to work on the farms. And so, even if you have a decent, reasonable system there, kind of the other constraints on the education system are pretty considerable there. What was your most memorable moment in Madagascar? Dear. Listen, that's a pretty interesting one. I think actually that trip that I took with Richard, Samuel, and Tina to their retirement home and to his town. I just felt then that I was learning things that a normal tourist, even if they went to the same town, would not learn. I just felt I was sort of getting inside the culture, and him talking about, the fact that, while being an educated guy and having advanced degrees, I mean, he sort of still had this sort of link to, his past as a noble past. I mean, to me, those sort of those were sort of fascinating connections. Yeah. I mean, having said that, he also, Madagascar's kind of isolated, and I was asking him about the cars, about the Renault cars, and because I was sort of interested in that and how they were kept going. And he asked me in French, vous avez beaucoup de 4L aux États-Unis. Do you have a lot of 4Ls in the United States? It's like, no, I don't think I've ever seen one there. But it was quite interesting. Here's this educated guy, who, advanced degrees in economic and development studies, but in his urban landscape, the 4L and the Citron de Chevaux are like the most common species. So it's kind of, a lot of people there haven't traveled outside Madagascar. They seem to, I mean, that's kind of what I hear. Even if they go to France, to study the, middle and upper class, they'll come back to Madagascar. Any time of, they wouldn't move. Of course, some people do move, but I mean, and so I think there's a sort of a limited perspectives on the outside world. I'm sorry, I really haven't answered your question very well there, but I've danced around it a bit. Okay.
David, have you kept in touch with Tina and I can't remember what his name is.
Richard, yeah. Periodically, yeah. I mean, I checked in on them a few months ago just to see how they were doing. I mean, COVID's in Madagascar. I don't think it's been too bad there. I mean, even in urban areas. So yeah, and there's a couple of other people I've checked in on as well. So yeah, I kind of value the people that I met there. They were lovely people, and I just feel very sad that shall we say, the country's so screwed up. I mean, it really is a very dysfunctional government, and people just sort of shrug their shoulders as to when it will ever change. I mean, and there's certain structural issues there. I mean, I heard from another colleague that the former president, the last president, is kind of like, who is president this week? Actually, Richard had a great line about this. He said that in one of his upper level undergraduate classes, one of the questions would be, who is the ministry, who's the minister of works or the minister of the interior? And all the students get it wrong because the ministers change on a monthly basis, But anyway, at this point, the president of the country, his political party had no seats in the legislature. I mean, that's a pretty dysfunctional way to run a country, So anyway, but I mean, it just, it does. I don't know. I feel a little guilty about sort of laughing a bit about this because I suppose I can, but I don't have to live with it, And this is a reality that many of these people face. Yeah. Okay, we're probably wrapping up here, are we? Or I'd be happy to take any more questions. And
I'm popping in the chat the registration link for next month's program, which you said was Bangladesh?
Yeah, we're going to go to Bangladesh, another place that means a lot to me. Yeah, Madagascar and Bangladesh mean a lot to me in different ways. But you'll have to wait for next month to find out why.
Well, thank you so much, David. This has been great. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. And we had some great questions. And
great questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. Stay safe, stay warm.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Well done.
I did have a question for you.
it seems like that the cattle are not well suited, particularly there in the south. Is there any movement to raise goats or sheep, which are a little bit more suited to arid conditions than cattle are?
Um, there are goats there. Sheep, I think there are sheep in parts of the country there. I mean, again, I think this is partly a cultural thing here in this historic, the cattle are called zebu. Historically, wealth was measured not in money, wealth was measured, well, at least historically, in the number of cattle that you had and the number of slaves you had. Well, no longer, the slaves are no longer in the equation there, but asking Malagasy to give up their cattle, even if it makes more economic or environmental sense, it's going to be difficult, because then you're breaking hundreds and hundreds of years of tradition. And I mean, it's not that they eat the beef all the time, but I mean, for every ritual ceremony, the Famadihana, the turning of the bones, for example, cattle are slaughtered for that. So there's a kind of a cultural and social significance there, which I'm sure the economists have gone in and said exactly the same. No, you shouldn't be trying to graze cattle here, let the goats run. And there are goats, certainly, as there are in other southern African countries, but getting people to give up their cattle, I mean, that's one cultural step too far. So I think you have the culture and the history colliding with what makes economic sense there. Good. Thank you for the question. I thought it was a very thoughtful question. Thank you.
You're okay now. Go ahead.
Is there internet there?
Internet?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you'll get internet in the capital, Tanner, and in some other places as well. The mobile phone network works pretty well, at least in the places where I was. In other places, though, I mean, there's just no electricity. So unless you've got a solar panel or some form of battery, there's no access. So in most rural areas, no, absolutely not. No, I think that mobile phones probably are going to be, the best way to communicate. And so even in rather poor communities, you'll find fairly high penetration of mobile phones. That's the way that people communicate. That's the way people will do business. So, but again, in the urban areas, outside the urban areas, no, very little, very little coverage. Yeah, again, that's something that has to happen. Television hasn't really penetrated very far out of the urban areas as well. So, I mean, radio remains an important medium of communication. So, I mean, in terms of things like natural disasters now and warning and things like that, I would put radio and SMS messages as the primary means that people learn about the storm coming or something like that. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I really appreciate everybody's questions, and I'll hope to see you all on, I think it's March the 1st, the next first Tuesday of March for Bangladesh. Thank you so much, and thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Storrs Library.
Thank you, David.
Bye-bye.
Take care.